The blood-curdling scream pierced the still afternoon air, snapping Grace Collins from her thoughts as she hung laundry outside her modest cabin on the outskirts of Unionville, Nevada. It was 1876, 3 years since she'd made this dusty mining town her home, and she'd grown accustomed to its rhythms and sounds, but that cry was different. It was a child's scream. Grace dropped the wet sheet back into the basket and lifted her skirts, running toward the sound without hesitation. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she followed the cries to Willow Creek, where spring rains had turned the usually docile stream into a surging torrent. There, clinging to a branch that extended over the rushing water, was a small boy no more than 5 years old. His face was pale with terror, his little hands white-knuckled as they gripped the wood that bent perilously under his weight. "Hold on, sweetheart," Grace called, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her chest. "I'm coming for you." The boy's wide eyes locked onto hers, tears streaming down his dirt-smudged face. "Help me, please." Grace scanned the creek bank, looking for the safest approach. She couldn't swim well growing up in Boston, hadn't provided many opportunities to learn, but she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She spotted a fallen log stretching partway across the creek and made her decision. Hitching up her skirts and tying them in a knot at her knees, Grace carefully stepped onto the log. The wood was slick with moss, and she nearly lost her footing immediately. Steadying herself, she edged forward inch by inch, the roaring water just below her. "What's your name, honey?" she called, trying to keep the boy calm. "Tommy," he whimpered, his grip visibly weakening. "Tommy, I'm Grace." "I'm going to get you, but you need to hold on just a little longer," she encouraged, moving further along the log. It creaked ominously beneath her weight. Grace was halfway across when she heard the crack. The log shifted, and she scrambled to maintain her balance. The branch Tommy clung to dipped lower, now barely above the rushing water. "Miss, I can't hold on," Tommy cried, his small fingers slipping. Grace lunged forward, stretching her arm as far as she could, but she remained several feet short of reaching him. "Tommy, look at me," she commanded. "When I count to 3, I need you to let go and reach for my hand. Can you do that?" The terror in the boy's eyes intensified, but he gave a tiny nod. 1, 2, 3. Tommy released the branch and reached toward her just as Grace pushed off the log into the rushing water. The cold shocked her system, stealing her breath as the current immediately tried to sweep her away. Her hand found Tommy's wrist and closed around it with fierce determination. The water pulled at them both, dragging them downstream. Grace fought against the current, kicking and struggling toward the bank while keeping Tommy's head above water. Her lungs burned, her sodden skirts weighed her down like anchors, but she refused to let go. The boy's frightened cries spurred her onward as they were swept around a bend in the creek. Her foot struck a rock, sending pain shooting up her leg, but it gave her something to push against. With one desperate lunge, Grace flung Tommy toward the bank. The boy scrambled onto solid ground, coughing and sputtering, but the current still had Grace in its grip. She clawed at the muddy bank, her fingers finding no purchase as the water pulled her downstream. Her strength was fading, her limbs growing heavier with each passing second. "Help!" she gasped before the water dragged her under. Then strong hands grabbed her arms, hauling her roughly from the creek's clutches. Grace coughed violently as she was dragged onto the bank, water pouring from her mouth and nose. When her vision cleared, she found herself looking up into the most piercing blue eyes she'd ever seen. "Easy now, madam," a deep voice drawled. "You're safe." The man kneeling beside her wore a weather-beaten hat and a duster spotted with trail dust. His face was tanned and lined from years under the sun, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble. A cowboy, Grace realized as she struggled to sit up. "Tommy," she gasped. "The boy, he's right here," the cowboy said, gesturing to where Tommy sat wrapped in the man's coat, still trembling but safely on dry land. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen a person do. Grace pushed wet hair from her face, suddenly aware of how she must look soaked to the skin, her carefully pinned hair hanging in sodden strands, her dress clinging to her body. She tried to stand, but her injured ankle gave way beneath her. The cowboy caught her before she hit the ground. "Whoa there, seems like you've hurt yourself." "I need to get him home," Grace insisted, gesturing toward Tommy. "Madam, with all due respect, you've done enough heroics for one day." The cowboy's expression softened as he looked at her. "She tried to save the child alone," he said, almost to himself, then added, "You don't have to be strong by yourself." Something in his tone made Grace pause. For 3 years since her parents' deaths had left her alone in the world, she'd been exactly that strong by herself because she'd had no choice. The gentle rebuke in this stranger's voice touched something vulnerable within her. "I'm Adam Lane," the cowboy continued. "Let me help you both." Grace hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Grace Collins," she replied, her voice hoarse from swallowing creek water. "Thank you, Mr. Lane." Adam scooped up Tommy with one arm and offered Grace his other. She leaned against him, wincing as she hobbled alongside him. "Where do you live, son?" Adam asked the boy. Tommy pointed with a small hand. "The blacksmith shop. My pa's the smith." Grace recognized him, then Henry Miller's youngest boy. She'd seen him playing outside the smithy in town but hadn't properly met the family yet. "And you, Miss Collins?" Adam asked, his gaze steady on hers. "Cabin at the edge of town, near the old oak." She suddenly remembered the laundry she'd left out. Such a mundane concern seemed absurd after what had just happened, and despite herself, Grace gave a short, almost hysterical laugh. Adam raised an eyebrow. "Something amusing about nearly drowning?" "No, she shook her head. "Just thinking about my laundry." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well, I reckon that'll still be there. Let's get this young man home first, then see to you." As they made their slow way toward town, Tommy gradually stopped shivering and began to explain how he'd ended up in such a predicament. "I was chassin' a frog," he said solemnly. "Then I slipped." "Your ma must be worried sick," Grace said. Tommy's face fell. "Ma died last winter." "It's just me and Pa now." Grace's heart clenched. She knew all too well what it was to lose family. "I'm sorry, Tommy." By the time they reached the smithy, word of the incident had somehow preceded them. Henry Miller came running out, his face ashen beneath the soot from his forge. "Tommy," he cried, rushing forward to take his son from Adam's arms. "My God, boy, what happened?" While Adam explained the situation, Grace stood awkwardly to the side, suddenly self-conscious of her bedraggled appearance as several townspeople gathered around. Unionville wasn't a large settlement. Mostly miners, merchants, and a few families, and news traveled fast. "Miss Collins saved him," Adam concluded, a note of respect in his voice. Henry Miller turned to Grace, his eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, clutching Tommy to his chest. "Anyone would have done the same," Grace demurred, uncomfortable with the attention. "No, they wouldn't," Adam countered quietly. "Most would have run for help. You jumped in." Before Grace could respond, Mrs. Winters, the storekeeper's wife, stepped forward with a blanket, wrapping it around Grace's shoulders. "You need to get dry before you catch your death," she clucked, eyeing Grace's soaked clothing with concern. "I'll see Miss Collins home," Adam offered. "She's hurt her ankle." Henry nodded gratefully, still holding Tommy close. "I'll come by later, Miss Collins. There's no way I can ever repay what you did today, but I'll surely try." With the small crowd beginning to disperse, Adam helped Grace limp toward her cabin. The adrenaline that had carried her this far was fading rapidly, leaving her shivering and exhausted. "You're not from around here originally, are you?" Adam asked as they made their slow progress. "Boston," Grace replied through chattering teeth. "Came west 3 years ago after my parents died." "Influenza." Adam nodded sympathetically. "Tough journey for a woman alone. I managed." Pride crept into her voice despite her bedraggled state. "Never said you didn't," he responded, adjusting his grip to better support her weight. "But managing and living are two different things." The observation hit closer to home than Grace cared to admit. She had been managing teaching at Unionville's small school, maintaining her modest cabin, existing day to day, but she couldn't honestly say she'd been living. Not fully. What brings you to Unionville, Mr. Lane? She asked, deliberately changing the subject. Adam, he corrected. I've got a small ranch about 10 miles outside of town, came in for supplies. A wry smile crossed his face. Wasn't planning on fishing anyone out of Willow Creek today. They reached her cabin, a simple one-room structure with a small porch. Grace fumbled with the key, her fingers still numb from the cold water. Allow me, Adam said, gently taking the key and unlocking the door. He helped her inside but remained respectfully on the threshold. You should get into dry clothes. I'll wait out here, then have a look at that ankle if you'll permit it. Grace hesitated, but the throbbing pain convinced her. Thank you, I won't be long. Inside, she peeled off her sodden dress and undergarments, dried herself hastily with a towel, and changed into her only other good dress, a simple blue calico. She unwound her wet hair and toweled it as best she could before limping back to the door. Come in, she called, suddenly feeling awkward about having a man in her home. It wasn't proper, but these were hardly normal circumstances. Adam entered, his tall frame making the small cabin seem even smaller. His eyes took in the neat, sparse furnishings, the iron bedstead with its patchwork quilt, the small table with 2 chairs, the modest cookstove, and the single bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes. Sit, he instructed, gesturing to one of the chairs. Let me see that ankle. Grace sat, extending her injured foot. Adam knelt and gently removed her shoe, his touch impersonal but careful as he examined the swelling. It's not broken, he pronounced after a moment. Bad sprain, though. You should stay off it for a few days. Grace shook her head immediately. I can't. I have school to teach. The children of Unionville can survive a few days without their education, Miss Collins. Grace, she corrected automatically. And I need the money. I can't afford to miss work. Adam frowned but didn't argue. Instead, he rose and moved to her small kitchen area. Do you have any cloths I could use? We need to wrap it, and cold compresses will help with the swelling. Grace directed him to a drawer containing clean rags. As he worked, she studied him more carefully. Adam Lane was handsome in a rugged way, she had to admit. Not the polished, educated men she'd known in Boston, but there was something compelling about his quiet competence and the gentle way his calloused hands tended to her injury. How long have you been teaching? He asked as he wrapped her ankle with surprising skill. Since I arrived. The town needed a teacher and I needed work. Grace watched him secure the bandage. You seem to know what you're doing. Had my share of injuries working cattle. Adam finished wrapping and sat back on his heels. You should elevate it when you can. A knock at the door interrupted them. Henry Miller stood outside with Tommy, now dried and changed into clean clothes. The blacksmith clutched his hat in his hands, still looking shaken. Miss Collins, I had to come thank you properly, he said, his voice thick with emotion. If you hadn't been there. I'm just glad I heard him, Grace replied, smiling at Tommy. Pa says you're a hero, Tommy announced, looking at Grace with wide, admiring eyes. Grace felt her cheeks warm. I'm no hero, Tommy, just happened to be in the right place. Henry shook his head. Not many would have done what you did. Town's talking about it already. He paused, shifting uncomfortably. I can't offer much by way of thanks, but I insist on helping while you recover. Tommy and I will bring you meals, and I'll chop enough firewood to last you through next winter. That's really not necessary, Grace began. It is to me, Henry said firmly. My boy's all I've got in this world, Miss Collins. Grace understood then that allowing him to help wasn't just for her benefit, but for his a way to process his gratitude and fear. Thank you, Mr. Miller. That's very kind. After they left, promising to return with supper later, Adam rose from where he'd been sitting quietly during the exchange. I should be going too, he said. Is there anything you need before I leave? Grace suddenly felt reluctant to see him go, though she couldn't quite explain why. No, I'll be fine. Thank you for your help, Mr. Adam, he nodded, settling his hat back on his head. I'll check on you tomorrow if that's all right. Make sure that ankle's healing properly. You don't need to trouble yourself, Grace said automatically. Adam paused at the door, that same hint of a smile playing at his lips. "It's no trouble. Besides, like I said before, you don't have to be strong by yourself." With a tip of his hat, he was gone. Grace sat in the sudden quiet of her cabin, the events of the day washing over her. She'd nearly died saving Tommy Miller, yet somehow the most unsettling part of her day was the cowboy's parting words, "You don't have to be strong by yourself." For 3 years, that was exactly what she'd been. The idea that she might lean on someone else, even temporarily, was both foreign and strangely enticing. Grace shifted in her chair, elevating her injured ankle as Adam had suggested. Her gaze fell on the abandoned laundry basket just visible through the window. It would have to wait. For once, she decided, she would allow herself this moment of weakness. Just this once. What she didn't yet realize was how that decision would alter the course of her carefully ordered life in ways she could never have imagined. The following morning, Grace awoke to the sound of activity outside her cabin. Wincing as she put weight on her swollen ankle, she hobbled to the window and peered out. To her astonishment, Adam Lane was in her yard, hanging her forgotten laundry on the line. Grace hastily pinned up her hair, splashed water on her face, and made her way to the door. When she stepped outside, Adam turned, a damp sheet in his hands. "Good morning," he called, looking not at all self-conscious about handling a woman's laundry. "Hope I didn't wake you." "What are you doing?" Grace asked, clutching the doorframe for support. "Seemed ashamed to let all this washing go to waste," he replied, efficiently pinning the sheet to the line. "Thought you might appreciate having it done before you tried tackling it yourself." Grace didn't know whether to be touched by his thoughtfulness or mortified that a stranger was handling her personal items. "Mr. Lane, this is highly irregular." "So was jumping into Willow Creek after a child," he countered mildly. Sometimes irregular circumstances call for irregular solutions. He had a point, but still. "I appreciate the gesture, but Miss Collins," Adam interrupted, his expression growing serious. "I understand pride. Believe me, I do, but there's no shame in accepting help when you need it." Grace bit her lip. The man was infuriatingly reasonable. "At least come in for coffee when you're finished," she relented. Adam's smile warmed his eyes. "That'd be nice." While he finished with the laundry, Grace brewed coffee on her small stove and set out the remaining biscuits from her last baking. By the time Adam entered, removing his hat respectfully at the door, she had composed herself. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "For the laundry, my pleasure." He accepted the cup of coffee she offered. "How's the ankle this morning?" "Painful," Grace admitted, "but I've decided to hold classes anyway. I can sit while teaching." Adam looked like he wanted to object, but instead took a sip of his coffee. "This is good," he remarked, sounding genuinely impressed. "One advantage of growing up in Boston, I learned to make proper coffee." Grace sat across from him, elevating her foot on a nearby stool. "You mentioned you have a ranch," Adam nodded. "Nothing fancy." "About 100 head of cattle, a few horses, it's enough." "You run it alone?" "Got a couple of hands who help with the bigger jobs. Mostly it's just me, though." Grace studied him over the rim of her cup. "That sounds solitary." A slight smile touched Adam's lips. "Says the woman who lives alone in a one-room cabin at the edge of town." Their eyes met, and Grace felt an unexpected flutter in her stomach. There was a mutual recognition in that moment, two people who understood solitude, though perhaps for different reasons. "I should get to the schoolhouse," Grace said, breaking the moment. "The children will be arriving soon." "Let me help you there," Adam offered. When she started to object, he added, "For the children's sake, wouldn't want their teacher collapsing halfway through arithmetic." Grace reluctantly agreed. The walk to Unionville's small schoolhouse took twice as long as usual with her injury, but Adam's steady support made it manageable. Children were already gathering outside when they arrived, their curious eyes taking in the sight of their teacher leaning on the tall cowboy's arm. Miss Collins saved Tommy Miller from drowning. One of the older boys announced excitedly to the others who hadn't yet heard. "Is that why you're limping, Miss Collins?" Little Sarah Jenkins asked, her eyes wide. I hurt my ankle, but it will be fine soon, Grace assured them, feeling self-conscious as more parents arrived with their children, many stopping to express their admiration for her bravery. Adam helped her inside and waited until she was settled at her desk before taking his leave. I have business in town today, he said. I'll come by after school to help you home. That's really not, I insist, he said firmly. Then, with a tip of his hat to the curious children, he was gone. The school day passed in a blur. Despite her best efforts to focus on lessons, Grace found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to Adam Lane. There was something both unsettling and comforting about his quiet presence, his matter-of-fact insistence on helping her. True to his word, Adam was waiting when she dismissed the children for the day. By then, Grace's ankle was throbbing painfully, and she was secretly relieved to see him. "Busy day?" he asked, offering his arm. The children were more interested in my heroic rescue than in their multiplication tables, Grace admitted as they began the slow walk back to her cabin. Can't blame them. It's not every day their teacher jumps into a raging creek. They walked in comfortable silence for a while before Adam spoke again. "I've been thinking about your situation," Grace raised an eyebrow. "My situation, your ankle, teaching, the distance to the school," he hesitated. "I've got a buggy. I could drive you to and from school until you're healed up proper." The offer took Grace by surprise. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition if it's offered freely," Adam interrupted gently. "Besides, I told you I have business in town for a few days." It would be no trouble, Grace considered. The practical benefits were undeniable. "Why are you being so helpful to a stranger, Mr. Lane?" Adam was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead. "My sister died 3 years back," he finally said. "Fever took her. Before that, she was the stubbornest woman I ever knew wouldn't accept help even when she needed it most." His jaw tightened briefly. "Guess I recognize a bit of that same spirit in you." The personal admission touched Grace. "I'm sorry about your sister." "Thank you." He glanced down at her. "So about that buggy ride?" Grace found herself nodding. "All right. Thank you." When they reached her cabin, Henry Miller and Tommy were waiting with a pot of stew and fresh bread. The blacksmith had also stacked a cord of firewood neatly beside her porch. "Evening, Miss Collins, Mr. Lane," Henry greeted them. "Tommy and I brought supper like I promised." "That smells wonderful," Grace said sincerely, her stomach rumbling at the aroma. "Thank you both." Tommy approached her shyly, holding something in his small hands. "I made you this," he said, presenting her with a crudely carved wooden heart. "Pa helped a little." Grace's own heart melted at the gesture. "Tommy, it's beautiful, thank you." After the Millers departed, Adam helped Grace inside with the food. "Looks like you've earned yourself some friends," he observed. "It seems so." Grace set the wooden heart on her small mantel. "Will you stay for supper? There's plenty." The invitation surprised them both. Adam hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd be honored." They ate Henry Miller's hearty stew, the conversation flowing more easily than Grace would have expected. Adam told her about growing up in Missouri, his decision to head west after the war, and his gradual acquisition of land outside Unionville. Grace, in turn, shared stories of Boston, her parents, and the challenging journey west. "What made you choose teaching?" Adam asked as they finished their meal. Grace smiled, thinking of her students. "I've always loved learning and passing that on to children. It feels meaningful. Like I'm contributing something worthwhile." She paused. "Though I must admit, when I came west, I wasn't certain what I would do. Teaching was one of the few respectable options for a woman alone." "Do you ever regret it? Coming west, I mean." Grace considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "It was difficult at first, but I've found a place for myself here. Independence has its own rewards." Adam nodded thoughtfully. "That it does, though sometimes I wonder if we mistake isolation for independence." His words lingered in Grace's mind long after he'd left, promising to return with the buggy in the morning. Was that what she'd been doing these past 3 years? Mistaking her isolation for independence? The thought was still with her the next morning when Adam arrived with a well-maintained buggy pulled by a handsome bay horse. He helped Grace up onto the seat with careful hands, then climbed up beside her. "This is Red," he said, patting the horse's flank. "Best buggy horse in Nevada territory." "He's beautiful," Grace said, admiring the animal's glossy coat. The ride to the schoolhouse was pleasant, the spring morning crisp and clear. Several townspeople called greetings as they passed, their curious eyes noting Grace's presence beside the rancher. "People are going to talk," Grace said quietly. Adam shrugged. "People always talk. Question is whether you care what they say." "A teacher has to maintain a certain reputation," Grace pointed out. "Being helped by a neighbor when you're injured seems perfectly respectable to me." He glanced at her with amusement. "Unless you're worried they'll think there's more to it," Grace felt her cheeks warm. "I merely meant I know what you meant," Adam said gently. "And I respect it. But Unionville isn't Boston, Grace. Folks here judge by actions more than appearances." The use of her first name sent a small thrill through her that Grace tried to ignore. Adam was right, she wasn't in Boston anymore, where strict social protocols dictated every interaction. Still, the idea of becoming the subject of town gossip was uncomfortable. When they reached the schoolhouse, Adam helped her down from the buggy. "I'll be back when school lets out," he promised. "What business keeps you in town, if you don't mind my asking?" Grace inquired, realizing she'd never questioned it before. A shadow passed over Adam's face. "Deed matters with the county clerk. My neighbor's trying to claim part of my south pasture belongs to him." He shook his head. "Nothing for you to worry about." But the brief darkness in his expression suggested it was more serious than he let on. Before Grace could inquire further, the first of her students arrived, and the moment passed. Throughout the day, Grace found her thoughts returning to Adam. There was clearly more to his land dispute than he'd revealed, and she was surprised by her own curiosity. For someone who had deliberately kept people at arm's length for years, her growing interest in the rancher was unexpected. That afternoon, Adam was waiting as promised. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes more pronounced, but he smiled when he saw her. "How was school?" he asked, helping her into the buggy. "Productive. We finally mastered long division." Grace settled her skirts. "And your business with the clerk?" Adam's jaw tightened as he took his seat beside her. "Complicated. Elijah Blackwood's got friends in the county office, makes things difficult." "Blackwood? The cattle baron?" Grace had heard the name. Everyone in the territory knew of Blackwood Ranch, the largest spread in the region. Adam nodded, flicking the reins to set Red in motion. "That's the one, been trying to push smaller ranchers out for years. Now he's claiming my water rights aren't legal. Can he do that, legally?" "No, but men like Blackwood don't always concern themselves with what's legal." Adam's voice was controlled, but Grace could hear the undercurrent of anger. "Sorry, you don't need to be burdened with my troubles." "It's not a burden to listen," Grace said softly. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that left Grace feeling slightly breathless. The next few days fell into a pattern. Adam would arrive each morning with the buggy, drive Grace to school, then return in the afternoon to take her home. Sometimes they would talk about their days. Other times they rode in comfortable silence. Grace found herself looking forward to these shared moments, to the sound of Adam's voice and the quiet strength of his presence. By Friday, her ankle was much improved, though still tender. When Adam helped her down from the buggy that afternoon, she didn't immediately step away, and they stood close together, his hands still at her waist. "Thank you for your kindness this week," Grace said, suddenly aware of how near he was, of the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. "It's been my pleasure," Adam replied, his voice deeper than usual. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Adam cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should be getting back to the ranch," he said. "Got neglected chores waiting for me." Grace nodded, ignoring the flicker of disappointment. "Of course, I've kept you from your work too long already." Adam hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Almost forgot. This is for you. Grace unwrapped it carefully to find a beautifully carved wooden cane, the handle shaped like a bird in flight. Made it in the evenings, Adam explained, looking almost shy. Thought it might help until your ankle's fully healed. Grace ran her fingers over the smooth wood, touched beyond words by the thoughtful gift. Adam, it's beautiful. It's practical, he corrected, though he looked pleased by her reaction. I noticed you're still favoring that ankle. Thank you, Grace said simply, knowing no elaborate words could convey what the gesture meant to her. Adam tipped his hat, a small smile playing at his lips. I'll be out at the ranch for the next few days, but I'll stop by when I'm next in town. Just to check on you. After he left, Grace stood on her porch, watching until his buggy disappeared around the bend. The carved cane in her hand felt like more than just a practical aid. It was a testament to Adam's care, to the hours he'd spent crafting something specifically for her. The realization that she would miss seeing him daily came as a surprise. Somehow, in the span of less than a week, Adam Lane had become important to her. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Grace tested the cane, finding it perfectly suited to her height. As she walked back inside, she wondered when exactly her carefully constructed independence had begun to feel less like freedom and more like isolation. The weekend passed slowly. Grace's ankle improved enough that she could walk short distances without pain, though she treasured the cane Adam had made. On Sunday, she attended church services, where several townspeople, including the Millers, made a point of greeting her warmly. Miss Collins, Sheriff Davis approached after the service, been meaning to tell you what you did for the Miller boy was mighty brave. Thank you, Sheriff, Grace replied, though I fear people are making more of it than it deserves, risking your life for a child. Seems deserving of some recognition. The sheriff smiled kindly. Town council's talking about presenting you with a commendation next meeting. Grace protested, embarrassed by the attention, but the sheriff waved away her objections. Pride of our community, Miss Collins. Let folks show their appreciation. As Grace made her slow way home, using Adam's cane, she reflected on how different this was from her previous experience in Unionville. For 3 years, she'd been respected as the schoolteacher but had kept largely to herself. Now, people greeted her by name, inquired after her health, invited her to Sunday dinners. One person was noticeably absent, however. Despite finding herself looking for him, Grace saw no sign of Adam Lane in town. Monday and Tuesday passed without word from him. Grace told herself it was natural he had a ranch to run. After all, but she couldn't help feeling disappointed. She'd grown accustomed to his company more quickly than she cared to admit. On Wednesday afternoon, as Grace was dismissing her students, Tommy Miller came running up to her desk. Miss Collins, there's a man outside asking for you, he said excitedly. He looks real mean. Surprised, Grace made her way to the schoolhouse door. Standing beside a magnificent black horse was a tall, imposing man in an expensive suit. His silver hair and carefully trimmed beard gave him a distinguished appearance, but there was something cold in his pale eyes. Miss Collins, he inquired, his voice cultured but hard. Yes, can I help you? The man removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Elijah Blackwood. I wanted to meet the town heroine in person. Grace stiffened at the name. Adam's nemesis. Mr. Blackwood, this is unexpected. I apologize for the intrusion, but I had business in town and heard about your brave rescue. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Admirable. Thank you, Grace replied cautiously. If you'll excuse me, I need to lock up. Of course. Blackwood stepped aside but didn't leave. I understand you've become acquainted with one of my neighbors, Adam Lane. The casual mention of Adam put Grace immediately on guard. Mr. Lane was kind enough to help me after my injury. Blackwood nodded, watching her carefully. Lane's a stubborn man, refuses to see reason. Regarding what, Mr. Blackwood? Business matters, nothing that would interest a schoolteacher. He studied her, his gaze calculating. Unless, of course, Lane has involved you in his affairs. He has not, Grace said firmly. And I make a point of forming my own opinions about people. A flicker of amusement crossed Blackwood's face. Spirited, I can see why Lane is drawn to you. He replaced his hat. A word of advice, Miss Collins, be careful about the company you keep. Some men in these parts have uncertain futures. The thinly veiled threat sent a chill down Grace's spine. Good day, Mr. Blackwood. Good day, Miss Collins. He mounted his horse with the ease of a lifelong rider. I'm sure we'll meet again. Grace watched him ride away, her unease growing. The encounter felt deliberate, a warning of some kind. As soon as Blackwood was out of sight, she hurried as fast as her healing ankle would allow toward Adam's ranch. The 10-mile journey was daunting on foot, but Grace was determined. She had barely covered 2 miles, however, when a familiar buggy appeared on the road ahead. Relief flooded through her at the sight of Adam driving toward her. He pulled up sharply when he saw her. Grace. What are you doing out here? His expression shifted from surprise to concern as he jumped down from the buggy. Blackwood came to see me, Grace said without preamble. At the school, he mentioned you. Adam's face darkened. What did he say? Grace recounted the brief conversation, watching Adam's jaw tighten as she spoke. When she finished, he helped her into the buggy without comment, then climbed up beside her. I don't like that he approached you, Adam said finally, his voice controlled but angry. Blackwood doesn't do anything without a reason. He was trying to intimidate me, Grace realized. But why? Adam was silent for a long moment, his hands gripping the reins tightly. Because he knows. Knows what? His eyes met hers, intense and troubled. That you've come to matter to me. The simple declaration stole Grace's breath. For a moment neither spoke, the weight of his words hanging between them. I'm sorry I didn't come by sooner, Adam continued. Things at the ranch, there was trouble. What happened? Grace asked softly. Found 2 of my cattle shot dead near the property line. Blackwood's men, I'd wager, though I can't prove it. Adam's expression was grim. He's escalating. Grace placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. What will you do? What I've always done. Stand my ground. He covered her hand with his own. But I don't want you caught in the middle of this, Grace. I already am, she said simply. And I choose to be. Adam looked at her for a long moment, something like wonder in his eyes. Then, to Grace's surprise, he pulled the buggy to a stop. Adam. Without a word, he turned to her, one hand coming up to cradle her cheek. His eyes asked a question, and Grace answered by leaning into his touch, slowly. Giving her every opportunity to pull away, Adam lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but when Grace responded, her hand rising to his shoulder, it deepened into something more urgent. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Adam rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that since the day I pulled you from Willow Creek, he admitted. Grace smiled, her heart racing. I might have let you even then. Adam laughed softly, the sound warming her. Somehow I doubt that. You were too busy insisting you didn't need help. I've been reconsidering that position, Grace said, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I'm finding there are advantages to not being strong by myself all the time. Adam kissed her again, briefly but with feeling, before reluctantly pulling away. We should get you home, he said, though he made no immediate move to set the buggy in motion. Or, Grace suggested, surprising herself with her boldness, you could show me your ranch. A slow smile spread across Adam's face. I'd like that very much. They traveled the remaining miles to Adam's ranch in a comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing, exchanged glances speaking volumes. Grace felt as though something fundamental had shifted inside her, a wall she'd built around herself slowly crumbling. Adam's ranch was modest but well-maintained. A sturdy main house, a barn, corrals, and outbuildings formed a neat compound against a backdrop of rolling grassland and distant mountains. 2 men working with horses in the corral waved as they approached. It's not much, Adam said as he helped Grace down from the buggy. But it's home. It's beautiful, Grace said sincerely, taking in the sweeping vista. So peaceful. Adam showed her around proudly, introducing her to his ranch hands, Pedro and Jake, who tipped their hats respectfully. The tour ended at the main house, a surprisingly comfortable two-story structure built of hewn logs. "My sister helped furnish it before she passed," Adam explained as they stepped inside. "Said no brother of hers was going to live like a savage." Grace smiled at the feminine touches evident in the curtains and quilts that softened the masculine space. She had good taste. They shared coffee at his kitchen table, talking easily as afternoon faded toward evening. Grace found herself reluctant to leave, even as she knew she should return to town before dark. "I'll drive you back," Adam said, reading her thoughts. "But I hope you'll come again, soon." "I'd like that," Grace replied. As they prepared to leave, a rider came galloping into the yard. Jake, Adam's younger ranch hand, dismounted in a rush, his face grim. "Boss," he called. "Got trouble. Blackwood's men are diverting the creek upstream. They've got gunmen posted." Adam's expression hardened. "How many men?" "4 that I saw." Adam turned to Grace, conflict evident in his eyes. "I have to handle this. Without that water, I understand," Grace interrupted. "Let me come with you." "Absolutely not," Adam said firmly. "This could get dangerous." "All the more reason you shouldn't face it alone," Grace insisted. "I'm not asking to confront armed men, Adam. But I can be a witness. If Blackwood's breaking the law, having the school teacher there to see it might make a difference." Adam started to object, then paused, considering. "You'd have to stay back, well back. I promise." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Jake, saddle a horse for Miss Collins, the gentlest we've got." 20 minutes later, they were riding toward the creek that marked the southern boundary of Adam's property. Grace, mounted on a placid mare named Daisy, followed Adam and Jake through the rolling grassland. Despite the circumstances, she couldn't help enjoying the feel of being on horseback again, something she hadn't done since leaving Boston. As they neared the creek, Adam signaled for them to dismount. "We'll go on foot from here," he said quietly. "Grace, you stay with the horses. Jake and I will see what we're dealing with." Grace nodded, though she was already formulating a different plan. As soon as Adam and Jake disappeared into the brush along the creek bank, she secured the horses and followed at a distance, moving carefully to avoid making noise. She could hear voices ahead, angry, confrontational. Creeping closer, Grace positioned herself behind a large boulder where she could see without being seen. Adam stood facing 3 men, rough-looking cowboys with guns holstered prominently on their hips. Behind them, a crude dam of logs and stones partially blocked the creek, diverting much of the water into a newly dug channel that led away from Adam's property. "This is illegal, and you know it," Adam was saying, his voice controlled but hard. "My water rights are registered with the territory." "Blackwood says different," the tallest of the men replied, his hand resting suggestively on his gun. "Says this creek's always been part of Blackwood land." "That's a lie," Adam stated flatly, "and your dam is coming down." The man took a step forward, his posture threatening. "Try it and you'll be buried next to those cows we shot." Grace gasped involuntarily at the admission. Unfortunately, the sound carried. The men's heads turned in her direction. "What was that?" one of them demanded. Before Adam could respond, Grace stepped out from behind the boulder. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Grace." Adam looked both shocked and furious. "I told you to stay back." "Miss Collins," one of the men recognized her. "What are you doing out here?" "Recording events for the sheriff's report," Grace improvised, noting with satisfaction how the men shifted uncomfortably. "Including the admission about shooting Mr. Lane's cattle, which I heard quite clearly." "This ain't your business, schoolteacher," the leader growled, though with less confidence than before. "Public education is very much my business," Grace replied, "as is the rule of law. The children of Unionville deserve to grow up in a community where water rights are respected and cattle aren't shot for a land grab." Adam moved to stand beside her, his shoulder touching hers in silent support. "You men have a choice," he said evenly. Dismantle that dam now or explain yourselves to Sheriff Davis, with Miss Collins as witness." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Their willingness to intimidate a lone rancher was evidently quite different from their enthusiasm for threatening the town's schoolteacher, particularly one who'd recently been lauded as a local hero. "Blackwood ain't gonna like this," the leader muttered, but he signaled to his men to begin dismantling the dam. Grace and Adam watched in silence as the men worked, the tension gradually easing as the water began flowing normally again. When they finished, they mounted up without further comment and rode off. Once they were gone, Adam turned to Grace, his expression a mixture of relief and exasperation. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've seen a person do," he said, echoing his words from the day they'd met. "It worked, didn't it?" Grace pointed out. Adam shook his head, a reluctant smile forming. "Yes, it worked, but Grace, these men are dangerous. Blackwood is dangerous." "So is letting bullies have their way," Grace said firmly. "My father always taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid." Adam studied her for a long moment, then pulled her into his arms. "You're remarkable," he murmured against her hair, "and terrifying." Grace laughed softly, relaxing into his embrace. "A woman of contradictions. Precisely the kind of woman I find myself falling in love with," Adam said quietly. Grace pulled back just enough to look up at him, her heart hammering. "That's a rather significant declaration, Mr. Lane. I'm a straightforward man, Miss Collins." His eyes held her steadily. "When I know what I want, I don't see the point in hiding it." "And what is it that you want?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam's hand came up to cradle her cheek. "You, a future with you if you'll have me." The simple honesty of his answer moved her deeply. For years, Grace had convinced herself that independence meant isolation, that strength meant solitude. But standing here in Adam's arms, she realized she'd been wrong. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would very much like to explore that possibility." Adam's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He lowered his head to kiss her, a kiss full of promise and possibility. Jake, who had been keeping a respectful distance, cleared his throat. "Boss. Should I head back to the ranch now that the situation's handled?" Adam reluctantly released Grace, though he kept one arm around her waist. "Yes, tell Pedro everything's under control." As Jake rode away, Adam turned back to Grace. "This isn't over with Blackwood, he'll try something else." "Then we'll face it together," Grace said simply. The look Adam gave her was worth all the uncertainty she'd felt, all the walls she'd had to let down to reach this point. "Together," he agreed. "I like the sound of that." They returned to the horses hand in hand, the setting sun painting the landscape in gold and amber. As Grace mounted Daisy, she realized with sudden clarity that the path ahead might not be easy, but for the first time in years, she wasn't walking it alone. And that, she decided, made all the difference. The following weeks brought significant changes to Grace's carefully ordered life. Word spread quickly about the confrontation at the creek. Jake, it seemed, was not one to keep an exciting story to himself, and Grace found herself the subject of renewed admiration in Unionville. "Standing up to Blackwood's men," Mrs. Winters exclaimed when Grace stopped by the general store. "First saving Tommy Miller, now this. You're becoming quite the town hero, Miss Collins." Grace demurred, uncomfortable with the attention but secretly pleased that public opinion had so clearly sided with Adam in his dispute with Blackwood. Even the county clerk, a man previously suspected of being in Blackwood's pocket, suddenly became more cooperative, discovering documents that confirmed Adam's water rights beyond question. More meaningful to Grace, however, was the deepening of her relationship with Adam. He came to town often, sometimes on business but more frequently just to see her. They took buggy rides on Sunday afternoons, shared meals, and talked for hours. Adam began attending church services in Unionville, sitting beside Grace in the pew and enduring the knowing smiles of the townspeople with good humor. "They think we're courting," he remarked one Sunday as they walked back to her cabin. Aren't we? Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. Adam's smile was slow and warm. I certainly hope so. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. In fact, I was hoping you might come out to the ranch for supper tomorrow. I've been practicing my cooking. Should I be concerned? Grace teased. Pedro assures me the biscuits are now edible, if not quite delicious. Adam squeezed her hand. Say yes. Yes, Grace replied without hesitation. The next evening, Adam arrived with the buggy just as Grace was finishing at the schoolhouse. They rode out to the ranch together, the conversation flowing easily between them. I've been thinking about expanding the garden, Adam said as they approached his property. Maybe planting some fruit trees. What do you think? I think it's a wonderful idea, Grace replied, touched by the way he valued her opinion. Apples would do well in this soil, I believe. Adam nodded thoughtfully. Apples it is, then. The simple domestic discussion filled Grace with a warm contentment she hadn't felt in years. When they arrived at the ranch, she noticed several improvements since her last visit: new curtains in the windows, a rocking chair on the porch, wildflowers in a vase on the kitchen table. The place looks different, she observed. Adam looked almost shy, made a few changes. Thought it could use a woman's touch. He paused. Or at least what I imagined a woman might like. The implications of his words were not lost on Grace. He was making his home more welcoming for her, creating a space where she might envision herself belonging. Supper was simple but tasty: beef stew, the promised biscuits indeed edible, and apple pie that Adam admitted Pedro's wife had made. Afterward, they sat on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. I love it here, Grace said softly. It's so peaceful. Adam's arm rested comfortably around her shoulders. It is, though it could use more laughter, children's voices. Grace's heart quickened at the casual reference to a future she'd barely allowed herself to imagine. Adam Lane, are you speaking hypothetically or making plans? In answer, Adam reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Grace's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a modest but perfect diamond. I had to ride all the way to Carson City to find this, he said, his voice husky with emotion. Grace Collins, I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. Will you marry me? Tears filled Grace's eyes as she looked from the ring to the face of the man she'd come to love with unexpected swiftness but absolute certainty. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. Adam slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then drew her into a kiss that sealed their promise to one another. When they finally parted, both were smiling through tears. When? Adam asked simply. Grace thought for a moment. The school term ends in 6 weeks. Perhaps then. 6 weeks it is, Adam agreed, pulling her close against his side. Though it's going to feel like an eternity. They sat together in contented silence until the chill of the evening air finally drove them inside. As Adam helped Grace into the buggy to return to town, he kissed her once more. I'll never tire of knowing I don't have to be strong by myself anymore, he murmured. That we can be strong together. His words echoed her own thoughts so precisely that Grace laughed softly. We make quite a pair, don't we? Both so used to standing alone. Not anymore, Adam said firmly, and the promise in his voice carried her home. The news of their engagement spread through Unionville like wildfire. Grace's students were particularly excited, the younger ones asking innocent but embarrassing questions about kissing and babies that made Grace blush to the roots of her hair. Not everyone was pleased, however. 3 days after Adam's proposal, Elijah Blackwood appeared at the schoolhouse door once again. Miss Collins, he greeted her coolly. Or should I say the future Mrs. Lane? Congratulations are in order, I understand. Grace faced him squarely, determined not to be intimidated. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Was there something you needed? Blackwood stepped into the empty schoolroom, his gaze moving deliberately around the space. I've been thinking about Unionville's educational needs. Such a small school for a growing community. The town deserves better, don't you think? Grace frowned, uncertain of his meaning. The school serves our purposes. For now, perhaps. Blackwood removed his hat, running his fingers along the brim. But what about the future? More children, better facilities. It would take money, resources. Is there a point to this conversation, Mr. Blackwood? His smile was cold. I'm prepared to make a substantial donation to build a new schoolhouse on one condition. Which is, convince Lane to sell his property to me. Blackwood's eyes hardened. Everyone has their price, Miss Collins. Even your cowboy. Grace felt a surge of anger. If that's what you believe, you don't know Adam at all, and you certainly don't know me. Don't be hasty, Blackwood advised. Think of the children of Unionville, think of your future. Lane's ranch is doomed one way or another, I'll have that land. Better it happens peacefully with compensation than otherwise. The threat hung in the air between them. Grace straightened her spine, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you leave now. Any further discussion about Adam's ranch should be with him directly. Blackwood studied her for a long moment before replacing his hat. You're making a mistake, Miss Collins, a serious one. The only mistake would be compromising my principles or asking Adam to compromise his for your benefit, Grace replied steadily. Good day, Mr. Blackwood. After he left, Grace sank into her chair, her hands trembling slightly. The implied threat in Blackwood's words was unmistakable. She needed to warn Adam immediately. That evening, she rode out to Adam's ranch, borrowing a horse from the livery stable. She found him in the barn where he was repairing a bridle by lantern light. Grace, he looked up in surprise. I wasn't expecting you tonight. She dismounted quickly, moving into his arms without hesitation. The solid strength of him reassured her as she recounted Blackwood's visit. Adam's expression darkened as she spoke, his hands tightening on her shoulders. The man doesn't give up, he muttered, but threatening you, that crosses a line. He didn't threaten me directly, Grace clarified, but the implication was clear. Adam, I'm worried. Adam pulled her close, resting his chin on the top of her head. I won't let him hurt you, Grace, I promise you that. It's not me I'm concerned about, she admitted. It's you, your ranch. Blackwood's been trying to run me off for years, Adam said grimly. He hasn't succeeded yet, and he won't now. He tilted her face up to his. But maybe it's time to bring this to a head, end it once and for all. How? Grace asked, concern evident in her voice. Adam's expression was resolute. By taking the fight to him legally. I've got documentation of everything, the cattle killings, the water diversion, the threats. With your testimony added, it might be enough for the territorial governor to step in. Grace nodded slowly. I'll do whatever I need to, but Adam, be careful. Men like Blackwood don't play by the rules. I know. His kiss was gentle but reassuring. But neither do I intend to live under constant threat, not when we're starting our life together. That night, Grace stayed at the ranch, sleeping in Adam's sister's old room while Adam took the sofa downstairs, a compromise between propriety and practicality, given the late hour and the potential danger. Despite the circumstances, Grace found herself imagining a future where this would be her home, where she would share Adam's bed as his wife, where perhaps children's laughter would indeed fill the rooms. In the morning, they rode into town together to speak with Sheriff Davis. The sheriff listened gravely to their account, making notes in his ledger. Been suspecting Blackwood's involvement in various incidents, he admitted when they finished, but proving it has been difficult. Your testimony changes things, Miss Collins. Will you help us? Adam asked directly. Sheriff Davis sighed, rubbing his graying mustache. I'll do what I can within the law, but Blackwood's got influence beyond Unionville. This may need to go higher. The territorial governor, Adam suggested. I have a friend in Carson City who might help arrange a meeting. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. Could work. In the meantime, I'll increase patrols near your property, Lane, and Miss Collins, you be careful too. Grace squeezed Adam's hand. We'll be cautious. As they left the sheriff's office, Adam turned to Grace with a determined expression. I need to ride to Carson City to speak with my friend. It's a 3-day round trip. I'm coming with you, Grace said immediately. Adam shook his head. You have school to teach and I'll move faster alone. Grace wanted to argue but knew he was right. Promise me you'll be careful. Always am. He kissed her briefly, mindful of their public location. I'll leave tomorrow at first light. With luck, I'll be back by week's end with good news. That night, Grace found it difficult to sleep, her mind full of worries for Adam and their future. She finally drifted off near dawn, only to be awakened by an urgent knocking at her door. Wrapping herself in a shawl, Grace opened the door to find Tommy Miller on her porch, his face streaked with tears. "Miss Collins, you gotta come quick," he gasped. "Mr. Lane's ranch is on fire." Grace's heart seemed to stop. "What? When?" "Just saw it from the hill. Pa sent me to get you while he went for the sheriff." Grace dressed in record time, her fingers fumbling with buttons as panic threatened to overwhelm her. By the time she reached the livery stable, a group of men was already mounted and ready to ride, including Sheriff Davis and Henry Miller. "Grace, you should stay here," the sheriff advised, but Grace was already pulling herself onto a saddled horse. "I'm coming," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. They rode hard toward Adam's ranch, and Grace's worst fears were confirmed as they crested the final hill. The barn was fully engulfed in flames, and the fire had spread to one side of the main house. Men Adam, Pedro, and Jake were working frantically with buckets trying to control the blaze. Grace dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, running toward Adam. He turned at her approach, his face blackened with soot, relief flooding his features when he saw her. "Grace, thank God." "Are you hurt?" she demanded, scanning him for injuries. "I'm fine." Adam pulled her briefly against him. "But this is Blackwood's doing. One of his men started it. Jake saw him running off." The men from town joined the firefighting efforts, forming a bucket line from the well to the burning buildings. After hours of exhausting work, they managed to save most of the main house, though the barn was a total loss. 2 horses had died in the blaze, trapped in their stalls. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the devastation, Grace found Adam sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. "All those years of work," he said quietly as she sat beside him. "And for what? Blackwood will just keep coming." Grace took his hand, holding it firmly between both of hers. "Then we fight back harder, we don't give up." Adam looked at her, his eyes red rimmed from smoke and exhaustion. "I can't risk you, Grace. If anything happened to you, nothing will happen to me," she interrupted firmly. "And nothing will happen to you or to this ranch. We're going to Carson City together today. We'll talk to the governor, get the territorial marshals involved if necessary." Adam studied her determined face, a hint of his usual smile returning. "Have I mentioned lately that I love you?" "You have," Grace said, leaning against his shoulder. "But I don't mind hearing it again." Sheriff Davis approached them, his expression grim. "Lane, I've got Jake's statement about the man he saw, one of Blackwood's known associates. This time, we've got him." Adam nodded tiredly. "We're riding to Carson City today to speak with the governor." "Will you keep an eye on things here?" "Count on it," the sheriff promised. "I've already sent a deputy to Blackwood's ranch with a warrant for his man. This crosses the line from property disputes into arson and attempted murder." With the sheriff's assurances, Adam and Grace prepared for their journey. They left Pedro and Jake to begin repairs, with several townsmen volunteering to help guard the property in shifts. The ride to Carson City was long and tiring, but Grace drew strength from Adam's presence beside her. They made camp the first night under the stars, and despite the circumstances, Grace found a certain peace in the simplicity of their situation: a fire, a meal shared, the vast sky above them. "When we're married," Adam said as they sat side by side, "we should do this sometimes." "Ride out, camp under the stars." Grace smiled at the thought. "I'd like that." Adam's friend in Carson City, a lawyer named David Mercer, welcomed them warmly and arranged a meeting with the territorial governor for the following morning. That night, they stayed in separate rooms at the city's best hotel, a luxury that felt almost decadent after their night camping. Governor Bradley listened attentively to their story, examining the documentation Adam had brought and taking notes as Grace recounted her confrontations with Blackwood. "This is deeply troubling," the governor said when they finished. "Land disputes are common enough, but arson, cattle killing, threats against a schoolteacher, these cross into criminal territory." "We need your help, sir," Adam said plainly. "Blackwood's influence makes it difficult for local law enforcement to act effectively." The governor nodded thoughtfully. "I'll send the territorial marshal to investigate immediately. In the meantime, I'm issuing an order protecting your water rights and property boundaries, Mr. Lane." He turned to Grace. "Miss Collins, your testimony has been invaluable. The territory of Nevada values its educators and will not tolerate threats against them." Relief flooded through Grace. "Thank you, Governor." With the governor's support secured, and the marshal preparing to ride to Unionville, Adam and Grace began their journey home the following day, their spirits considerably lighter despite the challenges that still lay ahead. "You think this will stop Blackwood?" Grace asked as they rode side by side. Adam considered the question seriously. "It may not stop him completely, but it will limit what he can do. The governor's support changes the balance of power." Grace nodded, hoping he was right. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Adam reached across to take her hand. "Together," he agreed. They returned to Unionville to find the community had rallied around them in their absence. Work on rebuilding Adam's barn was already underway, with lumber donated by the mill and labor freely given by townspeople. Even more surprising, the sheriff had successfully arrested Blackwood's man for the arson, and the suspect had implicated Blackwood himself under questioning. "Blackwood's been arrested," Sheriff Davis informed them as soon as they rode into town. "The territorial marshal arrived yesterday and took him into custody. He's facing serious charges." The news was almost too good to believe. That evening, as Grace and Adam sat on her porch discussing the remarkable turn of events, Henry Miller approached with Tommy beside him. "Evening, Miss Collins, Mr. Lane," Henry greeted them. "Tommy and I wanted to invite you both to supper tomorrow, sort of a celebration." "We'd be honored," Grace replied warmly. After they left, Adam pulled Grace into his arms. "It seems we have a lot to celebrate," he murmured, kissing her softly. "The end of Blackwood's threats, our upcoming wedding. Our future," Grace added, her heart full. "Together." Adam's smile was tender. "Together," he agreed. "No more having to be strong by yourself." As the weeks passed, life gradually returned to normal, or rather, a new normal that Grace found infinitely more satisfying than her previous solitary existence. The rebuilding of Adam's barn was completed with the help of the townspeople, a community effort that reflected their support for the couple. Blackwood remained in custody awaiting trial, his empire beginning to crumble as evidence of his various illegal activities mounted. The territorial marshal assured Adam that regardless of the outcome of the trial, Blackwood's days of intimidating smaller ranchers were over. Grace continued teaching while preparing for her wedding and her new life as Mrs. Lane. The children were particularly excited about the upcoming nuptials, offering advice and suggestions with endearing earnestness. "Will you still be our teacher after you're married, Miss Collins?" Little Sarah Jenkins asked one afternoon. Grace smiled, having anticipated this question. "For a while, yes. And even when I eventually stop teaching, I'll always be your friend." The wedding was set for the last Saturday in June after the school term ended. As the day approached, Grace found herself filled with a quiet joy that deepened with each passing hour. Her life had changed so dramatically since that fateful day when she'd heard Tommy's cries at Willow Creek, yet every change felt right, as though she was finally on the path she was meant to follow. The night before the wedding, Grace sat alone in her cabin, looking around at the simple space that had been her home for 3 years. Tomorrow she would leave it behind for Adam's ranch, their ranch. The thought brought no regret, only anticipation. A knock at the door interrupted her musings. Grace opened it to find Tommy Miller and his father standing on her porch, Tommy holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Evening, Miss Collins," Henry said. "Sorry to disturb you, but Tommy insisted on bringing you this tonight rather than waiting for tomorrow. It's a wedding present." Tommy announced proudly. "I made it myself, mostly." Grace invited them in and carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a wooden picture frame carved with wildflowers around the edges. In the frame was a simple but touching drawing of Grace pulling Tommy from the creek, with Adam reaching out to help them both. "Oh, Tommy," Grace whispered, tears filling her eyes. "It's beautiful." "Pa helped with the carving," Tommy admitted, "but I did the drawing." "See, it shows how you saved me and then Mr. Lane saved you. And now you're getting married." The child's simple summary of events made Grace smile through her tears. "It's perfect, Tommy. I'll treasure it always." After the Millers left, Grace placed the frame carefully in the trunk that contained her belongings for the move to the ranch. The drawing would have a place of honor in their home, a reminder of how their story began. The wedding day dawned clear and bright. The entire town of Unionville seemed to have turned out for the occasion, filling the small church to capacity and spilling out onto the grounds. Grace, wearing a gown of ivory satin that Mrs. Winters had helped her make, felt a sense of peace and rightness as she walked toward Adam, who waited for her at the altar with undisguised love in his eyes. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, and Grace felt her heart swell with emotion. This man beside her, this community around them, this was what it meant to truly belong somewhere, to someone. Their vows were simple but heartfelt. When Adam placed the gold band on her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his voice sure. "I take you, Grace Collins, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When Grace repeated the vows, her voice carrying clearly through the church, she meant every word with her whole heart and soul. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Adam's kiss was tender and reverent, a promise of all that was to come. When they turned to face their friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Lane, the cheers and applause were deafening. The celebration that followed at the town square was joyous and lively, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed twice the population of Unionville. As the sun began to set, Adam led Grace to the waiting buggy, decorated with flowers and ribbons for the occasion. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Lane?" he asked, his eyes reflecting the golden light of evening. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," Grace replied, knowing with absolute certainty that wherever Adam was, that was her home. They rode to the ranch in companionable silence, Grace's head resting on Adam's shoulder, his arm securely around her waist. When they arrived, Adam surprised her by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home," he said softly, setting her down in the front room that had been transformed with fresh flowers and candles for their wedding night. Grace looked around, noting all the little touches that made the space feel like theirs, her books now sharing shelf space with his, the quilt her mother had made now draped over the back of a chair, Tommy's framed drawing hanging on the wall. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning to face her husband. Adam's expression was full of such love that it took her breath away. "You're perfect," he corrected, drawing her into his arms, "and I'm the luckiest man in Nevada territory." That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Grace traced the lines of Adam's face with gentle fingers, memorizing him by touch. "Happy?" he asked, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Completely," she assured him. "Are you?" Adam's smile was visible even in the dim light. "More than I ever thought possible." He pulled her closer, his voice growing serious. "When I first saw you at Willow Creek, trying to save that child alone, something in me recognized something in you. That determination to stand on your own, to be strong no matter what." Grace nodded against his chest. "I've been that way since my parents died. Had to be." "I know," Adam said softly. "I was the same after losing my sister." "But Grace, When I told you that you didn't have to be strong by yourself, I was reminding myself as much as you. And now neither of us has to be, Grace murmured. That's the beauty of it, Adam agreed, his hand stroking her hair. We can be strong together for each other with each other. Grace lifted her head to look into his eyes. I love you, Adam Lane. And I love you, Grace Lane, he replied, sealing the words with a kiss that promised a lifetime of shared strength, shared joy, and shared love. 1 year later, Grace stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in vivid oranges and pinks. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the baby's movements within her. The past year had been one of profound happiness. The ranch was thriving, with Adam's careful management resulting in an expanded herd and improved pastures. The apple trees they'd planted were still small but growing steadily. Blackwood had been convicted and sent to prison. His empire divided and sold off to smaller ranchers, including a portion that had been added to the Lane property. Grace had continued teaching until the end of the spring term, when her advancing pregnancy made the daily trip to town too difficult. The school board had hired a replacement teacher with Grace's blessing, though she planned to return to occasional teaching once the baby was older. Admiring the sunset. Adam's voice came from behind her as his arms encircled her waist, his hands joining hers over their unborn child. It's beautiful tonight, Grace replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. Not as beautiful as you, Adam murmured, kissing the side of her neck. Grace laughed softly. You're biased, Mr. Lane. Proudly so, Mrs. Lane. They stood together, watching the colors deepen and then gradually fade as twilight descended. In the distance, they could see riders approaching Pedro and Jake returning from checking the north pasture. I received a letter from Tommy Miller today, Grace said. His father is considering my suggestion that Tommy attend school in Carson City next year. He has a real talent for drawing that should be nurtured. Adam nodded approvingly. You've made a difference in that boy's life, in many lives. We both have, Grace corrected. This community has become stronger since Blackwood's influence ended. People look out for each other more. The baby kicked vigorously, making them both laugh. Someone has an opinion about that, Adam remarked, caressing the spot where their child had made its presence known. He or she is going to be strong-willed, Grace predicted. With parents like us, how could they not be? Adam turned her gently in his arms to face him. Our child will know what it means to be part of something larger than themselves, a family, a community. They'll know the strength that comes from being supported and loved. Grace's eyes filled with happy tears. They'll never have to be strong all by themselves. Never, Adam agreed, kissing her with tenderness. And neither will we ever again. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Grace felt a profound sense of gratitude for the path that had led her here, for a child's cry that had pulled her from her solitary existence, for a creek that had nearly claimed her life, for a cowboy who had saved her in more ways than one. What are you thinking about? Adam asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Grace smiled up at him, her heart full to overflowing. I'm thinking that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from knowing when to reach for someone else's hand. Adam's answering smile reflected all the love in his heart. Your hand is the only one I'll ever want to hold, Grace Lane. Today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come. And as they walked hand in hand into their home, their future stretching before them bright with promise, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she truly belonged, not in independence, but in the shared strength of love. The end.